Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PSF 401 Political Behavior. This week we are looking at political parties. When we're thinking about political parties, a useful place to start is thinking about why do we have political parties. In every example of democracy that we have, we see political parties or otherwise factions emerge as a natural outgrowth of the democratic process. The reasons for this are relatively straightforward. Democracy is, at its core, a coalition building game. You need to join with like-minded individuals in order to make your voice heard and accomplish your policy aims. And so the most common way to do this is through political parties in order to increase your electoral prospects in order to achieve those aims. Now, if you look at the choice reading by Aldrich, you will note the diverse coalition view. Within this view, political parties come together as a, shall we say, a bunch of different policy aim groups coming together without mutually exclusive aims. Or to put it another way, if one group of people want to accomplish tax reform, another want to accomplish healthcare reform, another want to accomplish education reform, they will come together in order to accomplish their shared aims and have greater strength because they are joining together. Aldrich goes into great detail as to some of the hypothesized reasons of why we actually see political parties, but the fundamental intuition from Aldrich is that parties form and are maintained because they are valuable to office seekers and office holders, those politicians who are trying to get into office or who have already been elected. And we can understand that they are valuable because they do persist, and because those politicians, those office seekers and holders, put a great deal of effort into their maintenance. Parties themselves have a great deal of expertise and resources. If you are a first-time candidate and you opt to register through a party and stand for election as a member of that party, the party can help you out with filling out the requisite paperwork. They know how to conduct a campaign, or at the very least have contacts or can put you into contact with people that have run campaigns previously. They can put together the disclosure forms for you, and all of those kind of things. Parties have accumulated knowledge over decades on how to run and how to win elections. Parties also regulate access to the ballot through the primary process. Recently here in Alaska, we have adopted a top four primary system, somewhat limiting the ability of parties to exert this influence. But in most of the rest of the union, parties within the state themselves, they control who gets access to the ballot in terms of who is registered as a candidate of that party for that office. This, at least in theory, is supposed to prevent extremists or otherwise prevent individuals who have really no place within politics from standing for election and potentially being elected. Parties want to spend their scarce resources on good candidates, candidates that not only have a chance of winning election, but are also not going to undermine the chances of all the other candidates that are standing for election under that party label. They need to maintain the value of that party brand, if we want to put it that way. Furthermore, parties also help to coordinate action once individuals are in office. A bunch of legislators operating independently are not going to be nearly as effective as a bunch of legislators operating under the auspices of a political party. This is one of the reasons in the United States' system that party leadership in both the House and in the Senate exerts a significant impact on the actual legislative process. It's a coordination mechanism, and it is valuable not only to the party, but also to the individual politicians themselves. Another element and another reason why parties are valuable is that they provide information to voters through the use of coherent and connected platforms. This relates back to the concept of a brand. Even without knowing anything else about a particular candidate other than their party label, you very likely have a pretty good idea about what that candidate is going to support, what values they are going to stand for, and what policies they are going to try and get enacted. Depending on the specific context, depending on the time or the decade, that may change. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but generally speaking, parties maintain coherent and consistent platforms to ease identification and make it easy for individual voters to vote one way or another purely based on those partisan labels. Now, another question here is, what is the value of partisanship? When you are an individual voter and you say, I am a Democrat or I am registered as a Republican, what does that actually mean? Well, as discussed in the American Voter, party identification, this actually comes from a number of different places. Depending on how politically engaged and politically active your parents are, you very likely were socialized at an early age to have a positive image or a negative image of the political parties. If your parents were very active Democrats, it's very likely that some of those values and some of those views about the Democratic Party were imparted on you by your parents. But this isn't permanent. It is not the case that if your parents were Democratic, you will inevitably and always be Democratic. One of the main reasons why individuals' partisan identification changes is changes in their personal circumstances. The parties stand for certain things. They try and get different policies enacted. So at different stages of your life, you may be more or less aligned with either of the parties. When you get married, when you have children, when you get a better paying job, buy a home, retire, the party may better align with your interests at that moment in time. Now, not really discussed by Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes is the influence of peer groups or otherwise social influences, and this is another factor that can have a significant influence on an individual's partisanship. If your friends are all Democrats or your friends are all Republicans and they talk about politics a lot, you don't want to be the odd person out. You don't want to be ostracized from your group. As a result, and perhaps even subconsciously, your views and perceptions on these policy items on the political topics of the day will gradually change over time to cohere with the rest of your friend group or otherwise peer group. This isn't always the case. If you have a peer group or friend group that is completely removed from discussing politics, it may not come up. But with a politically active and politically engaged friend group, this is very likely to occur. Now, the textbook talks about the trend that we have observed in terms of partisanship, in that partisan identification has waned in the recent decades. This is very much true, with a greater number of people identifying as independent over time. We'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. But partisanship itself today is less valuable than it was in the 1950s and 1960s because there's much more information out there that makes it readily identifiable what a candidate stands for through an internet search or whatever it might be. Regardless of this decline in partisanship, an enormous number of people still are partisan one way or another, and many of these people view this attachment quite strongly. Now, alongside the decline of partisanship and growth of independence, we've actually seen an increase in the strength of partisanship at the same time. There may be less people who identify as Democrat or as Republican, but those that do identify that way identify much more strongly. And this has resulted in increased durability of these partisan identifications. In previous eras, where someone's partisan identification may have changed over time for a variety of reasons, now it's much more likely that that partisan identification will be maintained throughout their life. Another factor to consider with this increased strength and durability of partisan identification are the reasons why. And we touched on this a little bit in previous lectures, but it's the growth of the treatment of partisan identification as a social identity. And this is discussed by Green, Palmquist, and Schickler in terms of partisanship as a social identity. Basically, viewing yourself as part of this group, and that's important to you. As I discussed last week, belonging within a social group, belonging within a social identity has value to people. People like to belong within that group and will actively take measures to avoid being excised from that group or being ostracized from that group. You want to cohere within that group's social norms or norms of behavior. And if you value being a Democrat or if you value being a Republican in this way, it can have a significant effect on behaviors, on beliefs, on attitudes, and so on. Moreover, the partisanship in this context, when it is deeply held, can actually have an effect on the way that you interpret information and otherwise seek out information. You don't want to have cognitive dissonance. You don't want to have information that a politician that shares your partisan label is doing something wrong or is otherwise behaving in an untoward way, or a policy that they proposed is not performing in the way that you wished it would. As a result, you will either avoid that information, and in the practical context, perhaps that means not looking at certain news sources, or you will interpret certain information in such a way as to not contend or otherwise violate your previously held views, your preconceptions of what is true and what is false. This kind of avoidance of cognitive dissonance can make it so that people who have strong partisan attachments and view partisanship as a social identity fundamentally live in different informational worlds. The way that information is disseminated and interpreted is entirely different. And you can probably think about some examples from your own life in terms of this. In this view, partisanship is much more of a psychological attachment, much more of a psychological element than the kind of traditional view as espoused in the American voter of a shared set of policy priorities, for example. It is not just the case that people who are Democrat share certain values when it comes to immigration or education or healthcare. Instead, there is a sense of belonging and a value to that sense of belonging as a result of that partisan label and that social identity here. Now, partisanship itself can manifest in a variety of ways. Perhaps the simplest one of these is in terms of voting behavior. As a Democrat, as a Republican, if you have this partisan identity, if you have this partisan attachment, you may engage in what is called straight ticket voting, or voting for the Democratic or Republican candidate all down the ballot, without ever researching the individual candidates, without ever doing any additional research beyond the fact that they have that partisan label. The other element here is that the strength of partisan attachment is also directly correlated with the likelihood of an individual voting. If you are a strong Democrat, you feel that partisan attachment very strongly, you view it as part of your social identity, or to put it another way, when someone asks you what you are, instead of saying, I am an iron worker, or I am a Protestant, the first thing out of your mouth is, I am a Democrat. Within this context, you get value psychologically from going and voting, from rooting for your team, from supporting your team, from supporting your social identity, and contributing to that social group's victory over their perceived enemies within this context here. Another interesting element in terms of partisanship to consider is the concept of issue ownership. It is the case that the parties, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere around the world, have certain issues that the public, regardless of partisan identification to a degree, but largely regardless of partisan identification, will view that party, and in particular those politicians sharing that party label, as better or worse on. For example, a Republican candidate is very likely to be seen as more capable of dealing with issues pertaining to immigration or law and order. A Democratic candidate, on the other hand, will be better suited, or seen as better suited, to deal with issues pertaining to education or pertaining to healthcare. This concept of issue ownership is important, particularly when we think about how elections themselves are framed. The parties as a coalition will attempt to shape the content of a particular election around a certain issue, be it immigration, be it the economy, be it healthcare, be it education, whatever it might be, in order so that they have a built-in basic advantage over their political opponents in that election, because the baseline assumption is that the Democratic or the Republican Party is better suited to deal with that core issue in that given election here. Now, before we close, I mentioned about independence, and it's important to conceptualize this in two distinct ways. There are independents who simply eschew a partisan label, but still participate actively in politics. Very often, they'll lean one way or another. They will usually vote Republican or usually vote Democratic, but they don't want to associate themselves with that partisan label. That's one form of independence. The other form are those that are completely removed from politics. They don't engage. And so when we think about independence in this way, it's important to differentiate the two. Now, as I mentioned previously, the proportion of Americans who identify as independent has increased in the preceding decades. There are a variety of proposed explanations for this, but one that I think carries significant weight is a loss of both social and institutional trust. People trust political institutions much less now than they did in previous decades. One of the political institutions are political parties, and so it kind of makes sense when we see this loss of institutional or otherwise political trust that we would see a resulting decline in association with those political institutions. Thinking about the due dates for this week, you of course have your required reading, but you also have the choice to read one of three readings here. Aldrich really looks at party formation, looks at where parties come from, why parties are important, and what they actually do for politicians. The American Voter, Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, they look at, in the 1950s and 1960s, the bases of partisan identification and some of the effects that that has. Finally, Green and his co-authors look at partisanship as that social identity, as that kind of psychological attachment, and the effects that that can actually have. So when choosing which of these readings to read for this week, keep those in mind when making your decision here. So that is all that I have for you this week. Keep an eye on the due dates. You have your next reading analysis due this Sunday. And as always, feel free to reach out to me via email if you have any questions or concerns. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week.